Just in case, I'm making a backup to my computer just because it's been a night.
Hey. So welcome everyone. It's a little bit before 7 and we're starting the Zoom meeting. So it's good to see all of you. I'm George Smith and I'm the rector of St. Mark's Church in Glen Ellen, Illinois, and with me is David Canuti. We'll do introductions again in just a few minutes, but we're going to record this, and glad to see a number of you joining in tonight. Oh, and we are recording to YouTube. Laura, you are magnificent. Everything works out. Okay, we've got a few more people to let in. Here, I'm gonna be back in 1 second. I'm going to shut the door to another room. I don't have an echo.
Oh, because I have my sound on, George.
Should be fine as long as you've got the door shut.
I do now.
Yeah. George, will my cursor work on when the slides come up?
No, but you can. You have to tell me where to point.
Oh. Okay.
I'll be listening carefully. Again, as people are joining in Zoom, welcome. This is going to be a talk on Ukraine with a time for Q&A. So it's great having you all here. I see people from outside of our region.
Are we okay?
You are great. I see my uncle and my aunt from Minnesota. Good to see you.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So we'll wait just a couple more minutes if there are more people trying to join the Zoom.
Just drop my earbud here.
How much snow up there on the ground today, Paul and Carol?
Oh, we probably have about 10 inches.
Still?
Still.
Is that right?
And more is coming tonight.
Yeah, we're having more tonight again.
Wow.
I've had enough.
We probably haven't had 10 inches in the whole winter here in Madison.
Wow.
Well, we're getting rain here today, so it's the equivalent of 10 inches of snow, liquid form.
10 inches of snow in Embarrass is better than any inches of rain in Glen Ellen.
I
See, you get
accidentally
your
been
snowshoes
muted,
now.
George. I'm so sorry. There we go. My apologies.
It's okay.
I was trying to let
No.
people in and you were too fast for me. In a good way. In a good way. I'm thrilled.
All right. Well, I think we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is George Smith, and I'm the rector of St. Mark's Church in Glen Ellen, Illinois. And the idea for this talk came because I got a link to a paper written by my cousin, David Canuti, who's with us. And he is a retired analyst with the CIA and has spent at least 3 years in Moscow in his career. He has many friends and acquaintances in Russia and Ukraine, and he's written a great paper on the current crisis, and I invited him to join us and be able to share some of what he knows, and then for us to have some questions for him. So David, welcome to our Zoom meeting tonight, and we have a PowerPoint that goes with this, so if you want to start with some comments and let me know when to start the PowerPoint, we'll do that.
Okay. this paper and, well, this effort to sum up what's going on in the Ukraine really is sort of in the heart, from my heart, because watching the whole thing is very raises a lot of anguish for me. I put a lot of time and effort, 30 years effort, in a sense, to the end of the Soviet Union and the period, post-communist period. And I really had high hopes for that part of the world. It really was the kind of thing that has gotten, it really seems to have gotten really destroyed in a matter of literally months. And this is something that I think is a high tragedy, and a high tragedy for the Ukraine and a high tragedy for Russia. And part of what I talked about in the paper I wrote, which I refer you to, is a little bit of sympathy for what's happening to Russia's people, not for its leadership. And it's the kind of thing that this is too much of a tragedy to go unexplained. So this is my effort, and I will talk about the Ukraine. These slides are a little bit, this was near the final draft, and so I'm going to have to fill in some blanks, but feel free to ask me a question along the way, because really this is a story that has so many different angles to it. I mean, there's a historical angle. There is a current events angle for the American politics, and there is a current angle for the United States economy and the world economy. And there are, of course, many stories of tragedy and heroism in the Ukraine. And so I could go off on how did it all happen, what was led up to it, but there's so many different angles that what interests you is I will be happy to respond to. So let's take a look at the map. That explains something.
Just a second here, David. Let me get this set up.
Yeah, can't get rid of that pop-up. This meeting is being recorded pop-up.
So we have the first slide here, it takes a second to load.
Yeah, while we're waiting, I wanted to dig a little bit into history and dig a little bit into background geography. If we could get that pop-up, that wonderful pop-up down. The Ukraine is really a place that it arrived late in history. Putin says it never really arrived in history, that it was always just an assemblage of things that Russia pieced together and gave life to, and had the power to hold on to it forever, essentially, because it was part of this greater Slavic, East Slavic unity that he says it exists between the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, were the Malorussians, called in a lot of literature, the Malorussians, the Little Russians, and then the Veliki Russians, the Moscow Russians, the Great Russians, and all of them should be together joined in a common brotherhood. At least this is a Russian nationalist theory, and what is enamored Putin. He wrote a 13-page paper on it, which you can find on the internet. Just Google Putin, Russian Foreign Ministry, and it's a fascinating tour through history. But essentially, the Ukraine did come together out of a number of pieces. If we could get that that pop-up down. Is there any way to get that down?
That's actually only on your screen, so you
Oh.
can use your mouse and click it. Everybody else can. Nobody else is seeing that.
Oh, I see. I
Yeah.
see. Got it.
Sorry.
Got it. Ah, okay, we got it. Okay, looking at that map, the Ukraine could be divided into pieces that were finally assembled in the 20th century. And on the right, the far right, is let's start in the center. The yellow is the ancient Ukraine, the so-called Kievan Rus, that in the year 800 and in the years 800 to roughly 1240 was the capital of Russian culture, Russian Christianity. It was the so-called Kievan Rus that Moscow takes as the ultimate origin of its state. And the Kievan Rus is a area that is primarily Ukrainian today, but heavily Russian. And it's the sort of core of the Ukraine with this river running through it. On the right side of the river, looking down the river, is the western side, the side that was most influenced by the West, and that's the orange, and the western side of that yellow area. And then on the right is the left bank of the Ukraine of the Dvina River, which is the area that is been primarily the east and was the area which fought for control of the territory, essentially in the name of the Cossacks for a long time, but eventually in Russian against the Poles. And so on that side is the Russians, and then on the further to the east is the heavy blue area, and that today is called the Donbass, the basin of the Don River. And actually, in the Ukrainian side, it's the Donets River that runs through it. And that area was primarily the area inhabited by Cossacks, this kind of pioneering frontiersmen who were pivotal in Russian history. And then in the south was the broad steppe area of the plains that didn't really become controlled by Russia until the Crimean Tatars were finally conquered, and the Sultan and the Turks were finally expelled. So this area was Russian, or became Russian, but was rather late settled, and was primarily, or you couldn't say was primarily either Russian or Ukrainian. At any rate, when you think about it, that heavy blue area is what the Russians say when they want to talk about their objectives in consolidating the control of the Donbass. And we'll see in a map further on that actually their control of the Donbass is only in the far extreme sliver of it. And the other parts are still part of under the control of the Ukraine. So with that geography, proceed to something I've been talking about, the history. And there was this original Kievan Rus kingdom, but for a long time, after the Mongols, and that number should be turned around there. It should be 1240 that the Mongols essentially smashed Kievan Rus. From that point on, there was a long period of fragmentation, and then the Russian state began to emerge, and the Polish state extended its power into this right bank area I mentioned, and the Cossacks Russian ruled in various forms and in various ways that kind of open steppe area, and then the conquests of the Turks were added in. All this didn't really become a nation until really the late 19th century, when somehow the Ukrainians Ukrainians began to emerge as a separate cultural group under the area of Polish administration, that far right area. Just switching back to that, George, just switch back to that map a bit. On the far right, the far left in that orange area is the area which from time to time has been controlled by Hungary and Poland and is really the Western area. When they talk about Lviv, it's on the far area. And that's the area that is somewhat Catholic and somewhat Polish and very Western oriented, as opposed to the opposite pole on the other blue, deep blue area, the area that's Russian oriented and heavily Russian language. Okay, keep going. So Putin has taken upon himself to try and set the 20th century history of the Ukraine, sort of remake it. And at this point, the original formation of a Ukraine really didn't come into a separate body until the Soviets created a Ukrainian republic in the period after the revolution, forming the Soviet Union. And then various elements were added onto it. The far western area taken from Poland in World War II, and so forth. The Soviets conquered the west part of Poland and added it. Khrushchev, the Crimean area, which had been administered by Russia, was added in '56, and this state that had been sort of molded together out of more pieces than I've mentioned in the time the Soviet Union was in crisis, at the fall of communism or the communist government, the three republics simply voted to dissolve themselves, dissolve the whole thing. And that was the end of the Soviet Union. This, to Putin, was a great tragedy. He calls this a, quote, geopolitical tragedy. And particularly, he didn't like the idea that these fake republics, as he calls them, actually could just declare themselves independent. In a sense, they had to go through a divorce, and there had to be a struggle over the property, the joint property. And in his respect, probably the whole eastern half of the Ukraine should have been the joint property and gone to Russia. Anyway, go on, next one. So what did the Putin and the nationalists want? They really had a very, Putin had a very grandiose idea, not in history, that the Russian Empire should be restored, that this is something that was only natural, that the Slavs should be together, and that they should be in some kind of confederated or unified state. This slide has a lot of typos since we didn't get the final version in, but he essentially did not accept the idea that these states had any right to divide themselves, but they did. And it's important to remember that the United States did not do this. We did, in fact, just as a sidelight, I remember quite vividly at the time in the agency of talking about whether this was a good idea. And President Bush didn't exactly think it was a great idea either, that this kind of split might eventually produce a deep controversy. So at any rate, to make a long story short, NATO moved to the Russian border up in the Baltics, in Poland, a great irritant to Putin, something he has been trying to turn over. The Ukraine resisted his effort to win them over with it was in effect soft power, economic inducements, subsidies, and joining in a kind of economic parallel alternate union to the EU. This is something that the Ukrainians did not accept, and we'll go into what happened. And then also he would like to gain control over this eastern area, this heavy blue area, which might in fact, and the light blue area I showed you, which might in effect conceivably be annexed to Russia or be separated within a confederated, much weaker Ukrainian state. So this is the maximal objectives. When he went to war, he gained control over this eastern area, this heavy blue area, which, what about it?
No, there was an echo there. Don't ignore that.
Oh, okay. So the gaining control over this area would also have greatly facilitated his economic ideas about controlling the pipelines that leave Russia and head to Europe. And originally, the two major pipelines went through the Ukraine. There's been many pipelines since then, which is another story. But essentially, the Black Sea ports are where a lot of Russian, a quarter of the world's wheat travels, and half of it or more of it comes from Russia. And so this area would also be an extension of what used to be a common channel corridor to Europe from the Ukraine or from Russia. So go on. Now this was going back to minimal objectives. The minimal objectives was to gain control of this Crimean area, which had been seized, taking it back to George. Go to the next slide. See what that is. Yeah, go back. Okay. I'm a little bit handicapped here, but I'm going to add some more history. That after the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine went through a profound period of unrest, but part of it was whether or not to join in a tighter relationship to Russia or a tighter relationship to the West. And over the period of time, the idea of a close association with Russia came up and was constantly popular resistance resisted it, not just once in 2004, but also in 2014. And the uprising that in Maidan is what the origin of the Maidan Square uprising, when the Ukrainians were wanting to not join, but wanted to keep their agreement with the EU to join. They essentially occupied a mass occupation of the central square in Kiev, and the government, essentially, which had been turning toward Russia after this EU agreement had been tentatively agreed to, this was overturned, and then there was push came to shove, and there was fighting and shooting, and in the reaction and the general unrest, the government, the elected government, Russian government, the Russian ethnic president, who had been elected by in a democratic election, fled to Russia because of the opposition, the violence that was in Kiev over these treaties. So when this happened, Putin really couldn't stand this, and he took the opportunity because the state had collapsed in a sense, not completely, but had essentially been in a state of extreme weakness with the president gone, and there was a disorder about who was really in charge. He marched into the Crimea and seized it very easily, strangely with troops that didn't have uniforms on them, tried to make it look like a popular revolt, but it was in fact the most Russian area of the Ukraine. The eastern area, the blue area, the nationalists in the Oblast and on the east had been demonstrating and protesting, and this was probably the most Russian area of Russian sentiment in the Ukraine, although they had voted a majority for independence back in 1994. So at any rate, they marched in with some, again, troops out of uniform and backing up. These nationalists tried to seize this whole blue area. Well, it didn't work. They got as far as the edge of it, and the area that is up on the top of it near Kharkiv, and the area around that's currently in the news, Mariupol, were points of resistance. They never got beyond this sliver on the east, and they never got. But they claim to control that this area should be made part of a unified Confederate state, independent state. This is what the struggle is about. This is what the minimal goals versus the maximum goals. The maximum goals is that the Kiev state would the government and the pro-Western government would essentially be replaced. The minimal goals are that the Crimea and this greater blue area would be and essentially would be recognized as either separate or part of a Ukrainian state. Well, going on, I'm getting a little bit too deep in the weeds here.
So we were here at what Putin did not understand about the rules. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think that let's just go a little bit back where we go back a little bit further. I didn't understand. Yeah, go further than that. Oh, all right, go forward.
You want to go forward?
Yeah, go forward. He did not know the opposition in the Ukraine. And this Maidan period after 2014, when the government was overthrown, reconstituted, and in its period of weakness, the Russians, in effect, seized control of these areas. That was a real kind of turning point, and Putin, in effect, created Ukrainian nationalism. It was kind of like something that had been a kind of the Ukraine is a complicated place. It has a group of people who are ethnically Russians, who speak Russian at home as a native language. And they're about 20% of the population, maybe 25. Then the other large group, maybe 70% of the population, is Ukrainians, who in effect learn Ukrainian as a native language, but in effect were speaking Russian as a everyday language to a very large degree. And this pattern of a multi-ethnic society, somewhat like Belgium or somewhat like even Finland, when the Swedes were a much bigger part of society, this kind of multi-ethnic society was proceeding in a kind of evolutionary way. At some point, there was a question of national language, and Ukrainian was kind of imposed as a national language, but then the dual status of Russian sort of came back and forth. But during this period of a lot of turmoil and change, the Ukrainian people changed. And from the period, and particularly after this Maidan, the whole character of the attitudes of Ukrainian people, even though they were Russians, heavily strung toward a Ukrainian nationality. And so in a sense, Putin really created, to a large degree, the Ukrainian patriotism that we see today. Then carrying forward the idea that there should be, that there should be a modern, normal society is very strong in Ukraine. It's been criticized over the years as the most corrupt place. it certainly was a very corrupt place, and capitalism had a kind of rough beginning there. Oligarchs and carryovers from a lot of the communist whole system died slowly there, but there was a real existential commitment to doing something different and getting rid of the corruption, and that sense of a modern society was to come from the West. The rules and so forth imposed by the EU were seen as a kind of a salvation, an existential salvation of the Ukraine. And that's one reason why this opposition to Putin is so strong. And he can't understand that, really. He never has appreciated that, how much this is sort of built into the Ukrainian psyche. And then what he was thinking of, often, I put this last line of the slide here, Putin remembered the loyal Cossacks, these irregular warrior type troops that in various points in Russian history were the shock troops against Napoleon, and the shock troops against the Crimeans and the Tatars and the Turks, but they were also the rebellion, the leaders of great rebellions. And so he, remembering how much the ancient inhabitants of the Ukraine were oriented to the Tsar, he forgets how there was a continuing tradition of rebellion and of a effort to form an independent state. So that was we're seeing as sort of the fundamental mental mistake that he made, that he could just not accept that. Go on. Why attack at this time? We can go into that. I'm not going to go deep into this, but it wasn't exactly a well-calculated decision. He overestimated a lot of things in terms of his own sanction proofing, but he had created control of the government through his own cunning and sort of the traditions, authoritarian traditions in Russia. He managed to get a strong control over society, basically bringing order and renewed strength. He also thought that the U.S. was preoccupied with domestic issues. They say they really loved the story of January 6th in Moscow. They really they found that very entertaining, and it showed the weakness of the American state. And then maybe Biden didn't look like as manly a leader as Putin did. And then finally, the idea that Europe was really suffering coming out of the pandemic, but particularly from a long-range increase in energy prices and increased dependence on Russia for its energy supplies. And this was the time of they appeared to be very vulnerable to Russia, because without these supplies, the prices were going to go up, and this was politically destabilizing. And so I think he overestimated that. Go on. We can talk. Let's just go on a little bit about the sanction. Well, here we are with this map, and I won't go deeply into the fighting, but here it is, showed that essentially the Russians managed to quickly occupy from their external bases with the 190,000 troops that they had, quickly occupied the path to Kiev, but never could quite get into Kiev. And going to the next slide, you can see the detailed map here. You can see how that they have enveloped it on one side, but on the other side, they're really not really, it doesn't really complete a circle around Kiev.
You're looking at this inset map,
that
right?
inset map.
So here's the downtown Kiev, and you've got they're on either side, but not encircling.
Right. And there's actually a claim that they are pushing this line back on this side of Kiev. So they have not taken Kiev, but I think they're also reluctant to really go and annihilate Kiev, because if they do that, they will be essentially smashing what they purport to love and want to restore, is the ancient Rus, the Kievan Rus, and they'd be destroying the cathedrals and the monuments and the art that is associated with that if they really bomb Kiev. So there's been a certain inhibition there, but they have encountered a lot of resistance. And as you can see along this line, looking at what they, as of 2 weeks ago, which has not changed too much, they have essentially moved out from the south pretty strongly, but then failed to capture this Mariupol, and they have failed to conquer up here Kharkov. Kharkov being a city of 1.4 million, the second city in Russia, I mean in Ukraine, and a really heavily ethnic Russian area, as is Mariupol. They have also not moved toward Odessa, which is also a area of a lot of Russian population. Essentially, sort of the Russian population has kind of written a plebiscite with their resistance to conquest. And I think that's a pretty important point. Moving back to, so at this point, the one strong thing, moving back a couple things, couple
Do you want me to move
slides.
back to the previous slide,
Yeah, back.
to this one?
No. No, I guess moving forward a little bit.
Is this the
Moving
one you
forward.
want?
Yeah, moving forward. No, we're up to sanctions. Back a couple.
So this one is about the fighting in Ukraine.
Yeah, but up one from that even. Yeah. Oh dear. Well, at any rate, just move back again once more, I guess.
That was the Wine attack at this time.
No, I wish I could see this. Okay. Zip forward about 3. Let's see if I can.
So I'm just thinking about time. It's
Yeah.
if you want to.
Yeah, we're losing it to some degree. Okay, I would say that the other thing that was misjudged, and in a slide somewhere in here, is the fact that in fighting an insurgency and fighting a country on the defensive, you really have to have a preponderance of force to beat a army defending, a strongly dug-in defending army. And if you're going to defeat an army fighting or people resisting as an insurgency, yeah, there it is. Putin did not. No, we hit it back. Keep going. Yeah, there we go. Putin did not understand that what modern warfare is about. This modern asymmetrical warfare, and sometimes we have to try and understand it too. That when you're fighting an insurgent, you need a lot more manpower than actually the insurgency has, particularly when they're determined and they have an outside sanctuary, which is what we are providing and support. In addition, just being on the defensive provides a certain advantage. And then what has proved in the fighting in Ukraine has been that our advanced weapons on the ground without air power have proved very effective against tanks. And these handheld mobile weapons are very adaptable to guerrilla tactics. So that's been pretty much the story, I think, about stopping the Russians, in addition to their own foul up, screw ups. Well, Putin, the last thing Putin did not really understand is the sanctions, and the sanctions are I think are very much more powerful than moving forward one. Let's see. Forward again. Forward. Yeah, the sanctions. He did not have any idea of the sanctions that he would be hit with. And he had this idea that that he had a war chest of $600 billion that was going to be his sanction proofing reserves. And the Western governments, the US, simply said, well, if these are deposited in our country, we're going to freeze them. Now, this very much surprised me that they would take that kind of bad faith statement about the deposits in their banks. But we have said it. We have said that we can hold on to your bank accounts. And so half of his reserves really were not available to him. And so that was a big miscalculation on his part. And with cutting off the banks, the Russian banks were cut off from the world banking system. So they could not make the transactions to get at a lot of these reserves as well. They could not pay for things. They could not go in and, for example, buy food on the international market. And in addition, we cut off a number of other things like the SWIFT transaction processing, which was a computerized interface for transactions, and denied access to capital markets and also to technology markets and the computer and so forth. However, we did not stop access to oil and gas, which is an important point about going further, because essentially we did not want to cut off our nose to spite our face to create a oil and gas explosion, cost explosion that is to some degree occurring anyway. Next slide. The other thing I don't think anybody expected was the self-sanctions. And the over 400 companies have essentially cut themselves off from Russia. And this is something that was very spontaneous and very quick, and I did not foresee. But it's a major point that a lot of the nature of the Russian life these days is these international companies, particularly IKEA and McDonald's and Starbucks and Pepsi and Coke and Lucky Strikes, and all of these things are part of the Russian life. And to have them cut off is really, I think, very noticeable to the Russian people. And then, of course, the oil companies dropping out had something on so going further. So there's a lot of economic disruption going on. And I think that the idea that the Russians could resist these sanctions has really been tested. The day that the sanctions were announced, the ruble lost half of its value, and the interest rates were increased 20%, and inflation has started, and the Russian stock exchange had to be closed. These are things that have a long-term impact. Hit it again. So Russia's long-term, and I'll wrap it up here, Russia's long-term prospects have really been dimmed by this whole process, because essentially there's a moat, an economic moat being put up around Russia. It comes from these controls on technological imports, controls on capital, and it also comes on all of these companies in the world economic system, essentially running for cover, are cutting off the contacts that will not only contracts that exist, but contracts into the future for years to come. So the cutoff of these contacts with the West may not have stopped Putin in the field, but it certainly ought to stop any oligarch from feeling that this has been a good war, or that anybody who is a Russian patriot would feel that this is something that would be a good war. On the other hand, and this is next slide, what's the off ramp? I don't know what the off ramp is. Most people don't know. Sometimes I think a number of people like Biden are right that essentially Putin somehow has to go or be cut off. But to try and find some alternative center in power in Russia is really hard. And he really has gotten the security and the military have essentially been either co-opted, corrupted, or intimidated to the point where they do not really have an independent voice in making policy, or not even the hope of making it policy. And the business elite apparently is discounted, but they must have something to say about these real future problems. So hopefully Putin might see his minimal goals as maybe a face-saving alternative. Maybe just getting the Crimea recognized, maybe achieving some autonomous zone in the east might seem like a compromise, acceptable face-saving. But those are things that the Ukrainian people and the government are not particularly happy with. And if you ever had a vote in that eastern area, I'm saying, it would not be for Russia. It would not be for Russian control. They've been fighting along that frontier line between the Russian-controlled area and the rest of those areas for 10 years, and tens of thousands or 10,000 people have died. So it's hard to see how this is going to end, and I wish I can develop that idea a little bit further. So, been a lot of talk, not much room for questions.
Well, we've got some time for some questions, and maybe what would be good if people use the chat function and put some questions in there. But while they're doing that, I guess I'd like to ask you a question. Well, first of all, this is incredible information, David. You put a lot of information in 45 minutes for us. History, analysis, and it brings a lot together that we're getting in bits and pieces. One of the things that strikes me is that, you've got a polyglot historically, all these different nationalities and people. I mean, predominantly, Ukrainian speaking, but Russian speaking. But what you're saying is that it's kind of formed an identity, especially in the past 30 years. Is that true? I mean, is that strong enough?
Absolutely. And I tried to in that summary I made, in some ways, you could say Putin has put the finishing touches on creating a Ukrainian nationality, because even early in the 19th century, in the 20th century, when it came question with the referendum, the referendum to leave this voluntary association and be independent, it wasn't really clear how the Ukrainians were going to vote if given the chance. And they weren't really leading the charge against the Soviet Union. But they have, and of course, many Russians, that substantial Russian population, were identified with Russia. But over the period of turmoil and governments falling, but continuous democratic elections and a continuous desire to achieve a kind of post-Soviet, post-communist normality has really sunk into Ukrainian mentality. And what Putinism represented, I think, is authoritarian and a kind of corrupt capitalism, a capitalism dictated by favoritism from the top, and a lack of economic dynamism for the new economy. Russia, it falsely accused of being a petro state, but by God, it's not a favorable image. So that the progress, the image of progress, the existential desire to escape the past, escape the corruption, get focused away from Russia. Putin didn't grasp that, I think, at all.
So I have a question for you from the chat. And thanks for that response. How would you surmise that Putin will be removed from power?
There's a concept of the tipping points. That's things that aren't visible, maybe are piling up somewhere in the Russian structure. Strangely enough, Putin really comes up for election in 2 years. He has a constitutional problem in getting the Constitution reoriented to permit this further another term for himself. I don't know how much of that would have been, that wasn't considered a major problem, but that at some point, and that's no help right now, but at some point, he could conceivably be voted out of power or leave power. But it's hard to see something that isn't really an elite conspiracy, something where somebody at some point realizes things are seriously wrong. I would like to have thought that maybe the business people, the oligarchs, might be a voice in that kind of direction, combined with maybe some progressive forces in the military. But it seems that Putin has sort of co-opted not just the top level, but the next level of the military. It's really hard to know how the people around him think. They put a solid Russian nationalist front. But if things are going really bad, which I believe they are, that there may be some tipping point. By God, you got to get the Russians out of there, and I don't think the Ukrainians are going to be strong enough to throw them out.
All right. Well, maybe the tipping point is an interesting thing to hold on to. Here's another question, David. How much might China thwart the effects of sanctions on Russia?
China's been dancing around on that. And some Chinese companies have been actually following these sanctions that we have levied. Say that you can't not only you can't ship technology from the United States, but you can't ship licensed technology and technology with our patents and so forth to Russia. That apparently has some force in China, and Chinese government has not told all of its companies to avoid that. So that the push has not really come to shove. China has not stepped really strongly in favor of in instructions to defy the sanctions. I think they're waiting for something to happen that they don't have to get into a further tangle with the United States at this point.
So they're biding their time a little bit, in other words.
Yes, they're biding their time. But another thing to think about, and some thoughtful people have made this comment, that as we trample over these international world order understandings, particularly about the sanctity of your deposits in banks and the ability to move transactions through the financial system. The Chinese and Russians and other authoritarian governments might gravitate to an alternative system in which the Western sanctions can be avoided, and they can essentially run their nationalist games without fear of sanction interference. So that's a factor too. We can't push it too far. We've pushed it about as far as we can go, I think, right now.
So here's another question. I think this is the frustration I think many people feel. If we can't stop the Russians, and if the Russians can't stop Putin, how do we end the grinding down of Ukraine buildings and the killing of Ukraine citizens?
I said to myself, how can this go on? Another month of it. One thing about this is one of the most covered wars. I mean, talk about Vietnam being covered. This has every day wall-to-wall coverage around the world, and the sentiment in favor of the Ukraine and the isolation that Russia is increasingly experienced. Again, I think there is some tipping point there. I would, and this is a personal opinion, I would be surprised if there isn't some kind of concerted world appeal to stop this in a matter of weeks, months, something like that. The idea that it would drag on for years as an insurgency, which some people have mentioned, that in other words, if the government had fallen in Kiev, that there would just be a long-term guerrilla war, which we would somehow support. That doesn't seem to be the case. The government is standing. That reversion to a long-term guerrilla war, I don't think is sustainable. I think that, first of all, just our efforts to support a guerrilla war would eventually put us face to face with the Russians. At some point, if they try and cut off our shipments into the Ukraine, we're going to be face to face with the Russians. Don't talk about a no-fly zone. Watch these Polish supply points if they ever try and stop those. So, there's this is very squishy, but I think there's a turning point, a tipping point here internationally that will weigh finally on the Russians. Maybe we're seeing it now. I don't know.
A couple more questions. Thank you, David. If Putin were to achieve victory and control over the eastern region, how does it seem to be a benefit to him to inherit a disastrous destruction he has created there? Can he rebuild Mariupol?
Boy, I mean, this is what makes the whole enterprise so unfathomable. Colin Powell said about somewhere in the Middle East that we're involved. You broke it, you fix it. One of the problems making peace is that there needs to be reparations. There needs to be money to rebuild the Ukraine. And I think there's very little that Russia can take home from a victory in the Ukraine. Yes, those transit points, those corridors across to Europe, those would be, of course, theirs. But there would be so much destruction that it would be, I think, a liability rather than an asset. I think the Crimea has been a liability. One of the problems of the Donbass is that it essentially, like a Rust Belt, you could think of it as one of the great industrial areas of the Soviet Union, with its iron and steel and manufacturing, heavy manufacturing. But now that's not the future of the economy. The future of the economy is technology and light manufacturing and elaborate serving supply chains and so forth, how are those going to function in a state that's been flattened? That's what boggles the mind about this whole enterprise.
All right, I think we have time for maybe another question. So this, John writes, David, thank you very much for this presentation. As you hinted at, 40% of the world's wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine, and as I understand it, most of it is shipped to the Mideast and Africa. With the shipments being stopped, what do you perceive will happen to the stability of countries in those regions, and what would you expect the State Department is doing at this point addressing the destabilization?
Boy, well, I would say that what I've seen is 25 to 30%, but nevertheless, that's a substantial piece. And that just is not going to get through this year, I don't think, unless there's a miracle recovery of Ukrainian agricultural production and so forth. So it's a problem. It's one of a number of problems that are out there. And trying to get enough gas to Europe for next year's heating season, even if the war ended, is going to be a problem. So this war has created all kinds of disruptions, and that Near Eastern, the Near Eastern agricultural and food problems are a tremendous destabilizing factor. Somehow, the world has to deal with it, among all its other problems.
Do you think the State Department has any particular plan, or, I mean, are they working behind the scenes?
Well, I'm sure they're working behind the scenes. I don't know that they can hold Zelensky's hand as he goes to meet the Russians. Certainly, we're trying to work overtime to keep the allies lined up, keep the alliance lined up, but we don't seem, because of our antagonism, they're meeting in Turkey. The Ukrainians and the Russians are meeting in Turkey, and in terms of making peace, I guess we have to be involved in the end, maybe underwriting somehow without, they're talking about some kind of, the Ukrainians would like to have their boundaries and their independence underwritten by a guarantee that wouldn't be NATO's guarantee, somehow, some alternative guarantee. And who can participate in that but us? So, we have to be there.
All right, well, David, we have come upon the hour here, and I think there are a couple more questions, but I think we should probably honor our hour. Thank you for being with us. This has been really interesting. Thanks for the questions that have come through. David, you did such a great job. I think we'd like to invite you back again sometime. So.
Well, I'm sorry to talk too long and maybe not have left enough room for questions, but as I said, it's a very complicated subject that we're going to be sorting this out. Thank you for hearing me.
Yeah, well, we'll have this on YouTube for other people to watch, and you're going to see all the people clapping and thumbs up. And
thank you.
We're really grateful, and thank you. And it's been a blessing to us.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Right. Good night, everyone. We'll get David back. Encore.
Hopefully under the making of the peace.
Yes. That'll be good. We'll pray for that. Thank you.
Bye-bye.